This story is titled, Parents Ignored My Call for Help for 6 Hours. When I got in car crash because they were busy with my golden bro, years later he dumped them, and now they are begging for my help. Karma hit them hard. Hey there. We put a lot of effort into finding the best stories for you. If you're enjoying them and want to help us out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really supports our channel. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, Hey Reddit, I'm not really sure where to start with this. Writing this feels weird because it's bringing up a lot of stuff I've tried to move past, but I feel like I need to tell someone about it. Maybe writing it all out will help me process things better. So a little background first. I'm 24 now, but this story starts when I was 17. Growing up, I used to think my parents were awesome, like the kind of parents who made you feel supported and cared for no matter what. They were attentive, always involved in school events, and made sure I had everything I needed. But there was always this thing about them. My older brother Adam was clearly their favorite. I didn't want to believe it at first, but it was impossible to ignore. Adam was their golden child. If Adam needed something, he got it. If Adam wanted something, they bent over backward to make it happen. It wasn't like they were mean to me or ignored me outright. It's just that everything was about Adam. I never really resented him for it. At least not when I was younger. I just accepted that this was the way things were. But as I got older, the favoritism became harder to ignore, and it started to affect how I felt about my place in the family. Anyway, when I turned 17, I got my first real job. I was working as a server at a restaurant near my house, and I was proud of myself for finally having some independence. The shifts were late. Most nights I didn't get off until 1 a.m., but I didn't mind. I liked the work, and the tips were good. Here's where things start to go south. My parents had this rule about their phones. Every night, from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., their phones went on Do Not Disturb. They always said it was because they needed their rest and didn't want to be interrupted. We work hard all day, they'd say. We deserve some uninterrupted sleep. At first, it didn't bother me much. I mean, it's their phone, their rules, right? But after I started working late shifts, I asked them to at least make an exception for me. I told them, what if something happens? What if I need you? Their response? Nothing's going to happen. You're responsible enough to take care of yourself. And besides, your grandparents are always awake late if you really need someone. I let it go, but it never really sat right with me. What kind of parents would rather pass responsibility to someone else than be available for their own kid? Then came the night that changed everything. I was driving home from work after a long shift. It was one of those nights where everything had gone wrong at the restaurant. Short-staffed, angry customers, the works. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home and crash. About halfway home it happened. A car came out of nowhere, speeding through a red light, and slammed into mine. The impact was brutal. The sound of metal crunching, glass shattering. It was like something out of a nightmare. The airbags deployed, and I felt this sharp pain shoot through my chest and legs. For a moment, everything went black. When I came to, I was disoriented, and in so much pain I could barely think. My first instinct was to call my parents. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, but I managed to dial their number. Straight to voicemail. I tried again, and again. Same result. I knew why they weren't answering. Their phones were on Do Not Disturb. But in that moment, knowing they weren't there for me, knowing they'd chosen their sleep over being reachable for their kid, something inside me broke. Desperate, I started calling other family members. Most didn't pick up because it was the middle of the night, but finally, I got through to my grandparents. They didn't even hesitate. As soon as I told them what happened, they said, "We're on our way," and hung up. The ambulance arrived shortly after, and I was rushed to the hospital. The next few hours were a blur of doctors, pain, and fear. My injuries were worse than I'd realized. I had several fractures and internal bleeding that required immediate surgery. By the time my grandparents arrived, I was already being prepped for the operating room. Seeing their faces brought me a small sense of relief. At least someone was there for me. But my parents? They didn't even know I was in the hospital until the next morning. When they finally turned their phones back on at 7 a.m., they called me in a panic. What happened? Are you okay? I told them everything. That I'd been in a car accident. That I'd been rushed to the hospital. And that I'd already had surgery. Their response? We're so sorry. We had no idea. I was angry, but I tried to stay calm. Why didn't you come to the hospital last night? I asked. That's when they told me the real reason. Adam had a rough night, and we didn't want to leave him alone. You know how he gets. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents had chosen to stay home with Adam because he didn't like being left alone while I was lying in a hospital bed, scared and in pain. To be honest, I don't remember much about the rest of that day. I was still groggy from the surgery and overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But one thing was clear. My parents had let me down in the worst way possible. That night, as I lay in my hospital bed, I started to rethink everything I thought I knew about my family. My parents weren't the amazing, supportive people I'd always believed them to be. They were people who put their own comfort and Adam's above their responsibility to me. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it was just the beginning of a long journey that would change my relationship with them forever. After the accident, I thought things might get better between me and my parents. I thought maybe this would be the moment they'd realize how their choices affected me, and that they'd try to fix things. But it didn't play out that way. The first few weeks after I came home from the hospital were tense, to say the least. My body was a wreck. I had several broken bones, internal injuries, and a long recovery ahead of me. Physical therapy became a regular part of my life, and the doctors told me I'd likely have lasting limitations because of the accident. It was overwhelming, both physically and emotionally. My grandparents were there for me every step of the way. They drove me to my doctor's appointments, helped me with therapy, and made sure I had everything I needed. They didn't complain or make excuses. They just showed up. My parents, on the other hand, didn't seem to grasp how much their absence during the accident had hurt me. They offered to help, of course. They said all the right things. Let us take you to therapy. We can handle your groceries, and we'll do anything to make it up to you. But I didn't want their help. Every time they offered, it felt hollow. I kept thinking about how they weren't there when it mattered most, how they'd prioritized Adam over me when I was at my most vulnerable. The worst part was that Adam didn't seem to care at all. He barely acknowledged what had happened to me. When I first got home, he gave me this half-hearted, "Hope you're feeling better," and then went right back to whatever he was doing. I tried to let it go, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Adam was 20 at the time, more than old enough to be left alone for a few hours. But my parents acted like he was a toddler who couldn't handle them being away for one night. I asked my mom about it once, just to see if she understood how messed up the situation was. "Why didn't you come to the hospital that night?" I asked her. "You could have brought Adam with you if he didn't want to be alone." Her response made my blood boil. "He wasn't in a good place that night," she said. "You know how sensitive he is. We didn't want to upset him by leaving." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents had literally chosen Adam's comfort over my safety and well-being. How was that okay? Over time, the distance between me and my parents grew. I stopped talking to them unless it was absolutely necessary. I didn't want to hear their excuses or their apologies. I threw myself into my recovery instead. It was a slow, painful process, but I was determined to regain as much independence as possible. My grandparents were my rock during this time. They supported me without question, showing up to every appointment and cheering me on when I made progress. They even started subtly calling out my parents for their behavior. My grandma, who's usually the peacekeeper in the family, pulled my mom aside one day and said, "You need to do better by her. She's your daughter, not an afterthought." But my parents didn't seem to take it seriously. They kept insisting they'd learned their lesson, and that they'd never let something like this happen again. To be fair, they did change their phone policy after the accident. My siblings told me they now answer their phones at all hours, no matter what. But for me, it was too little, too late. Things finally came to a head a few months after the accident. My parents sat me down for a family meeting, something we hadn't done since I was a kid. They started with the usual apologies. "We're so sorry for what happened," my dad said. "We didn't mean to hurt you." My mom chimed in, "We love you and we just want to make things right." But then they pivoted. "You need to start letting us help you," my dad said. "We're your parents, and it's our job to take care of you." That's when I lost it. "Where was that energy the night of the accident?" I asked. "When I was lying in a hospital bed, scared and hurt, where were you?" "Well, that's right. You were at home with Adam because he didn't want to be left alone." They didn't know what to say. My mom started crying, which just made me angrier. "Stop crying," I said. "Crying doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change the fact that you chose him over me. You always choose him over me." For the first time, I saw my parents' faces shift from guilt to something else. Maybe realization, maybe denial. I couldn't tell. But they didn't argue with me. After that conversation, I pulled away even more. I refused their help with therapy, told them I didn't need their money, and kept all my interactions with them as brief as possible. It wasn't easy. A part of me wanted to forgive them, to move past everything and rebuild our relationship. But every time I thought about that night, about calling their phones over and over and hearing nothing but voicemail, I felt that same sense of abandonment all over again. My grandparents tried to mediate, of course. They kept telling me, "They're your parents. They love you. You have to find a way to forgive them." But I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't trust them anymore. By the time I turned 20, I had saved up enough money to move out of my parents' house. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small apartment, but it was mine, and it felt like freedom. My parents were devastated. They begged me to stay, saying they'd do whatever it took to fix things. But I was done. "I need space," I told them. "You've had years to make this right, and you didn't. I don't need you in my life anymore." They cried, of course. My mom kept saying, "You'll always be my baby," but it didn't mean anything to me anymore. That was the day I truly started to rebuild my life on my own terms. Once I moved out, I thought I'd finally have some peace. I figured the distance would make it easier to forget about the accident, the broken trust, and everything else my parents had done to let me down. For a while, it worked. Being on my own gave me the space to focus on myself, my recovery, my job, and rebuilding my life. But even with me out of the house, the shadow of Adam still loomed over everything. Adam had always been the golden child. Growing up, it was like he could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. Whether it was school, sports, or just being the perfect son, they praised him constantly. And if he ever messed up, they found a way to excuse it or blame someone else. After a while, it felt like their favoritism became even more glaring. While I was trying to heal and process everything that had happened, they were still completely wrapped up in Adam's world. At first, I didn't hear much about him. I had distanced myself from my parents, and I wasn't exactly keeping tabs on what Adam was doing. But then my grandparents started filling me in. "Your parents are so focused on Adam," my grandma said one day. "They're always worried about him." I asked her what she meant, and she sighed. "He's going through a lot," she said vaguely. It turned out Adam was having some issues with work. He'd bounced between a few different jobs, none of which seemed to stick. My grandparents said my parents were constantly bailing him out, paying his bills, helping him find new opportunities, and basically holding his hand through everything. It was frustrating to hear, but it wasn't surprising. This was classic Adam. He always relied on our parents to fix his problems, and they were more than happy to oblige. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was when I found out about the lengths my parents had gone to protect him during the night of my accident. One day, during a conversation with my grandma, she let something slip. "You know," she said, "your parents didn't even tell Adam you were in the hospital that night. They didn't want to upset him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Wait," I said, "are you telling me Adam didn't even know I'd been in an accident until the next day?" She nodded. "They said he wasn't in a good place to handle it. They thought it was better to wait." I was furious. Not only had my parents chosen to stay home with Adam instead of coming to the hospital, but they hadn't even bothered to tell him what was going on. They'd shielded him from the whole situation, as if his feelings were more important than my life. Over the next few months, my relationship with my parents went from distant to non-existent. Every interaction with them felt fake, like they were trying to win me back without actually addressing the root of the problem. Meanwhile, Adam continued to enjoy his golden child status. My parents were still bending over backward for him, even as he drifted further into his own messes. At one point, my mom called me and said, "We need to have a family dinner. It's been too long." I reluctantly agreed, figuring it was better to keep the peace. But when I showed up, the entire evening revolved around Adam. They spent the whole dinner talking about his job search, his hobbies, and his latest plans. My mom even said, "Adam's been working so hard lately. We're so proud of him." I sat there, quietly stewing, wondering if they even remembered everything I'd been through. The breaking point came a few years later when Adam started dating someone my parents didn't like. Her name was Jess, and from what little I knew of her, she seemed fine. She was smart, independent, and didn't put up with my parents' nonsense. But that's exactly what they hated about her. "She's a bad influence," my mom said during one of our rare phone calls. "She's changing Adam in ways we don't like." "Maybe he needs to change," I replied. That didn't go over well. My parents spent months trying to sabotage Adam's relationship with Jess. They accused her of being controlling, manipulative, and even claimed she was trying to isolate him from the family. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had spent my entire life isolating me in favor of Adam, and now they were upset because someone else was pulling him away from them. Eventually, Adam had enough. He moved out, cut off most contact with our parents, and started building a life with Jess. It was surreal to watch. For so long, I'd been the black sheep of the family, the one who was difficult and ungrateful for pulling away. But now Adam, their golden child, was doing the same thing. My grandparents called me one day and said, "Your parents don't know what to do. They're heartbroken over Adam." "Maybe they should have thought about that before trying to control his life," I said. Now, with Adam gone, my parents have turned their attention back to me. They've been calling more often, leaving voicemails about how much they miss me, and how they want to repair our relationship. They've even started sending me gifts, things they never bothered to do when I was living under their roof. It's clear they're trying to fill the void Adam left behind, but I'm not interested. My grandparents have asked me to give them another chance. They've learned from their mistakes, they said. They're trying to make things right. But I don't believe that. My parents haven't changed. They're just desperate now that their golden child has moved on. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that some relationships aren't worth saving. My parents made their choices, and I've made mine. After Adam distanced himself from my parents, I knew it was only a matter of time before they turned their attention back to me. At first, I thought maybe they'd leave me alone. I'd made it pretty clear over the years that I wasn't interested in rekindling our relationship, and I assumed they'd respect that. I was wrong. It started small, texts here and there, asking how I was doing or if I wanted to grab lunch. I ignored most of them, but they didn't stop. Then came the phone calls. My mom would leave voicemails saying things like, "We miss you, sweetheart. Can we talk?" Or, "Your dad and I have been thinking about you a lot lately. Please call us back." I didn't respond. Then they escalated their efforts. They started showing up unannounced at my apartment. The first time it happened, I opened the door and saw both of them standing there, looking nervous but determined. "We just want to talk," my mom said. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. I wasn't about to let them into my space. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "We miss you," my dad said. "We know we've made mistakes, but we want to fix things. Can we start over?" I stared at them, trying to process what they were saying. Start over? How do you start over with people who've spent your entire life prioritizing someone else? "You can't just show up here and expect everything to be fine," I said. "It doesn't work like that." My mom started crying, which wasn't surprising. She always cried when things didn't go her way. "We just want to be a family again," she said through her tears. I shook my head. "You made your choices a long time ago. I've moved on." They didn't have much to say after that. They left, but I could tell it wasn't the end of it. My grandparents got involved next. They called me one afternoon and said, "Your parents are trying so hard to make things right. Can't you just give them another chance?" I sighed, trying to keep my frustration in check. "They're only trying because Adam isn't around anymore," I said. "If he hadn't left, they wouldn't care about me." "That's not true," my grandma said. "They've always cared about you. They just made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I repeated. "Grandma, they abandoned me when I needed them the most. They've spent my entire life catering to Adam while treating me like an afterthought. That's not a mistake. It's a pattern." She didn't have an answer for that. The gifts started coming next. Random packages would show up at my door. Clothes, books, gift cards. Once they even sent me a care package with my favorite snacks and a handwritten note that said, "We love you and hope you're doing well." It was strange. My parents had never been the kind of people to show affection through gifts, so this felt forced, like they were trying to buy my forgiveness. I didn't know what to do with the stuff. Part of me wanted to throw it all away, but another part of me felt guilty. I ended up donating most of it, just to get it out of my apartment. The turning point came when they showed up at my grandparents' house during one of my visits. I'd been having dinner with my grandparents, enjoying the peacefulness of being around people who actually cared about me, when the doorbell rang. My grandpa went to answer it, and I heard my mom's voice. "Is she here? We need to talk to her." My grandpa hesitated, but my grandma told him to let them in. I froze as they walked into the dining room. My dad looked uncomfortable, and my mom had that overly apologetic expression she always used when she wanted something. "Can we talk?" she asked, looking at me. I put my fork down and leaned back in my chair. "Talk about what?" "About us," she said. "We want to fix things. We want you back in our lives." I glanced at my grandparents, who were watching the scene unfold in silence. I could tell they wanted me to hear my parents out, but I wasn't sure I had it in me. "Why now?" I asked. "Why is it so important to you all of a sudden?" "Because we love you," my dad said. "We always have, and we realize now that we've made mistakes." There it was again. Mistakes. They always used that word to downplay what they'd done, as if abandoning me during one of the scariest moments of my life was just a little slip-up. "It's not about mistakes," I said. "It's about trust. And I don't trust you anymore." My mom started crying again. "We've changed," she said. "We know we weren't there for you, but we're trying to be better." "Why didn't you try to be better when I was 17? I asked. "Why did it take Adam leaving for you to care about me?" They didn't have an answer for that. After they left, my grandparents tried to convince me to give them another chance. "They're trying so hard," my grandma said. "Don't you think they deserve some grace?" "Why should I give them grace when they've never given me any?" I replied. They've spent my entire life putting Adam first. They're only coming to me now because he's gone. I'm not a replacement for him. My grandpa nodded thoughtfully, but didn't say anything. I could tell he understood where I was coming from, even if he didn't agree with me. Since that night, I've been even more firm about my boundaries. My parents still reach out occasionally, but I rarely respond. I've made my decision, and I'm sticking to it. They want me back in their lives, but they don't want to do the real work it would take to repair our relationship. They just want things to go back to the way they were, where I accepted whatever scraps of attention they were willing to give me. I'm not interested in that. Over the years, my parents' efforts to bring me back into their lives haven't let up. At first, it was occasional texts, phone calls, and gifts. Then it turned into more desperate gestures, like showing up unannounced or trying to guilt me through my grandparents. At this point, I've accepted that they're never going to stop trying. But I've also accepted something else. I'm not going to let them back in. I know that sounds cold, and maybe it is, but I've spent too much of my life being second place in my own family. I've built a life for myself that's stable, peaceful, and free of their emotional manipulation. Letting them back in would mean opening myself up to the same hurt all over again, and I'm just not willing to do that. The latest chapter in their campaign to reconnect happened a few weeks ago. My mom sent me a long, emotional email. She talked about how much they missed me, how they regretted the way they treated me, and how they wanted to start fresh. She wrote things like, "We've learned from our mistakes," and "Family is too important to let these misunderstandings come between us." What struck me most was a single sentence near the end. "We just want to make things right before it's too late." I stared at that line for a long time. What did they mean by too late? Were they worried I'd cut them off permanently? That I'd never forgive them? Or were they realizing that they were getting older and might not have as much time left to fix things? The truth is, I think it was all of the above. After reading the email, I decided to sit with my feelings before responding, or deciding not to respond at all. I didn't want to react out of anger or guilt, and I needed time to process what they were really asking of me. As I thought about it, I kept coming back to one question: why now? The pattern was impossible to ignore. They didn't reach out after the accident because they were too busy with Adam. They didn't try to fix things when I moved out because they still had him around. It wasn't until Adam left them that they started trying to mend fences with me. Even now, their efforts felt less about truly repairing our relationship and more about filling the void Adam had left. They didn't want me back because they valued me. They wanted me back because they needed someone to replace him. The thing is, I don't owe them anything. That's been the hardest part to come to terms with. For years, I felt this nagging guilt, like I was the one being unreasonable for refusing to forgive them. I kept thinking, what if they really have changed? What if I'm the one holding on to the past? But then I remind myself of everything they've done, or rather, everything they didn't do. They didn't come to the hospital when I was lying there scared and hurt. They didn't put me first when I needed them most. And they didn't even tell Adam about the accident because they didn't want to upset him. Those aren't the actions of people who truly value you. Those are the actions of people who are comfortable putting you last. Recently, my grandparents asked me if I'd consider sitting down with my parents to clear the air. They really want to make things right, my grandma said. They're willing to do whatever it takes. I love my grandparents, and I know they mean well, but I couldn't help but feel frustrated. I've heard all this before, I told her. They always say they want to make things right, but they never actually address what they did. They just want to sweep it under the rug and pretend everything's fine. My grandpa chimed in, saying, "But don't you think it's worth giving them a chance? People can change, you know." "Sure, people can change," I said, "but that doesn't erase the damage they've already done, and it doesn't mean I have to let them back into my life." They didn't push me after that, which I appreciated, but I could tell they still hoped I'd change my mind. The truth is, I've already moved on. I have a good life now. I've found a job that accommodates my physical limitations and allows me to live comfortably. I've built a small but solid support system of friends who actually care about me. And most importantly, I've found peace. Letting my parents back in would jeopardize all of that. It would mean reopening old wounds and putting myself in a position to be hurt again. I'm not willing to do that, no matter how much they beg or how guilty they try to make me feel. I know some people might think I'm being too harsh. After all, they're my parents, and they've apologized for what they did. But an apology doesn't automatically fix everything. It doesn't undo years of neglect, favoritism, and betrayal. As for Adam, I haven't spoken to him in years. I hear bits and pieces about him through my grandparents. Apparently, he and Jess are still together, and they've built a life of their own. From what I can tell, he's happy. And honestly, I'm glad. He was as much a product of my parents' favoritism as I was a victim of it. I don't hold anything against him anymore. but I also don't feel the need to reconnect. We lived in two completely different worlds growing up, and I don't think there's enough common ground between us to rebuild a relationship. So, where does that leave me and my parents? Nowhere, really. They're still trying, and I'm still checked out. I don't hate them, but I don't love them the way I used to either. They're just people I used to know. People who made choices that I can't forgive. I've accepted that, and I'm at peace with it. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that family isn't defined by blood or titles. Family is about trust, support, and showing up for each other when it matters. My grandparents are my family. My friends are my family. My parents? They're just part of my past. Thanks for reading, Reddit. If you're in a similar situation, I hope this helps you feel less alone. And if you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. Take care.